Welcome to another exciting episode of Humanity 8.0, a podcast where we talk about our post-truth present and our transhuman future, with the aim of sketching out the outlines of what awaits us in the years and the decades ahead of us. This podcast is brought to you by Rokos. Companies with limited IT budgets and personnel can now get the same cybersecurity protection as big enterprises. Rokos' Secure Access Service Edge, SASE solution, with zero trust, provides enterprise-grade comprehensive cybersecurity so that you can focus on your business. For more, please visit www.rokos.com. That's ROQOS.com. And now, here's your host, Dr. Ahmed Bouzid, founder and CEO of Witlingo.
Gennady Stolyarov, welcome to Humanity 8.0.
Thank you, Ahmed. It is a pleasure to be speaking with you today.
Wonderful, wonderful. So as we were, you and I, chatting before we started recording, just want to give the audience sort of a context. I'm having these conversations with folks who have thought deeply and who are engaged actively in the world of transhumanism to understand a bit more after every conversation, as I was telling you, come up with more intelligent questions and just go deeper and deeper. So far I've spoken with Professor Steve Fuller, who has written a book about this. It's called Nietzschean Meditations and Timely Thoughts at the Dawn of the Transhuman Era. He's at Warwick. And then I'm reviewing this book here, which is called The Case Against Death, Ingemar Patrick Linden. Are you familiar with this book?
Yes, actually, I have a copy of this book, and we in the U.S. Transhumanist Party had Ingemar Patrick Linden as our guest of honor for one of our weekly virtual enlightenment salons in February of 2022.
Wonderful. Is that available somewhere online that I can point people to? Is it recorded?
Yes, there is a recording of the virtual enlightenment salon with Ingemar Patrick Linden. One can look it up via that title.
Wonderful. And I'll be reviewing this book for Social Epistemology, which is run by Steve Fuller and his team. So I spoke with Steve Fuller. I spoke with Zoltan Istvan. He is the founder of Transhumanist Party, is that right?
He is the founder of the Transhumanist Party, not of the philosophy of transhumanism, yes, but its political incarnation.
Political inclinations. And I spoke with, and we had a wonderful four-way conversation with you, with Joe Bardeen, with Andrea Kubitz a few weeks ago. We published that conversation as a two-parter, and then there'll be links to them as well. So as I was saying, I'm having conversations with folks who know a lot more than me, and hopefully as we do this, the audience also will be able to learn. So you yourself are chairman of the Transhumanist Party, is that right?
That's correct. I have been the chairman since November 17th, 2016.
And is this the same Transhumanist Party as Zoltan Istvan?
Yes. So Zoltan founded the U.S. Transhumanist Party. He was the first chairman and the first presidential candidate, and he ran for office in the 2016 U.S. general election. And after that election concluded, he decided to move on to other endeavors, and he asked me to become his successor as chairman of the U.S. Transhumanist Party.
Okay, we'll talk about that, but I want to take a step back. I was looking at your LinkedIn as I was telling you, and I noticed that you are a graduate of Hillsdale College, right?
Yes.
And the reason why I bring it up is it's interesting. It's a conservative Christian college, conservative, right? And if transhumanism is anything, it is non-conservative. It's pushing the envelope towards really new things and towards a reconception of many key things about life, God and life and death and so forth, right? So can you sort of like unravel the riddle of how can someone who comes from there, and again, I don't want to label you as anything, right? How can somebody who comes from a conservative Christian I don't know, college, and become such an avant-garde in pushing the envelope? I'm sorry.
It's interesting because I am identified on Wikipedia as one of the notable alumni of Hillsdale College, yet I have not yet received an award for being a notable alumnus of Hillsdale College, even though I did receive a triple major there in economics, mathematics, and German.
Yeah.
I actually got essentially 200 college credits there. And I was indeed a prominent part of the intellectual life on the Hillsdale College campus. So I applied to colleges on the basis of several factors.
Mhm.
One was the recognition of advanced placement credits. Another was the awarding of merit-based scholarships. And a third was the strength of Hillsdale's economics department. So on all of those counts, Hillsdale was definitely at the top of my list. I spent 4 years there, and it is an intellectually quite engaging place. As you pointed out, there is a certain conservative and especially in recent years, conservative Christian philosophical inclination on the Hillsdale campus. When I attended it, the college was officially non-denominational, and it still is, with the exception that there is now a mandatory theology course requirement. And to be honest, if I were a student applying to Hillsdale College now, that would have deterred me. Back then, there was a bit more openness for an atheist materialist such as myself to be part of that campus culture. And there is a significant element of that campus culture which is libertarian leaning. So I think within that sphere, it was possible to articulate ideas like the prospect for a secular moral framework that actually enhances people's lives to a greater extent, in my view, than traditional religious moral frameworks. And I was a transhumanist at the time I was a student at Hillsdale, and long before then, I was an implicit transhumanist. But in Hillsdale, I was quite explicit about my advocacy for radical life extension and various other technological transformations of our species and the potential of human beings. And this led to some interesting conversations. I think a lot of the professors and a lot of the students there are quite thoughtful, and they would engage with these ideas seriously, whether they agreed or disagreed. And there were some aspects of common ground that I could find with many others on campus from the standpoint of advocacy of individual freedom, the freedom to make certain choices, which I think does resonate with some aspects of American libertarian and even conservative thought. Of course, American conservatives will say you should have the freedom to make virtuous choices, and sometimes government restrictions or regulations will stand in the way of that. My view, though, of the nature of those virtuous choices may differ from theirs, but I would say it is virtuous to lengthen one's life, to pursue good health, to pursue intellectual and scientific and technological discoveries, and of course, to explore the world and all of its depth and richness and possibility. So I think it was definitely a good academically rigorous college to attend. From a public relations standpoint, I don't think they quite want to advertise that I went there, but who knows how the world might change and how even that intellectual atmosphere might change with the passage of time.
Yeah. I think it would be to their credit, actually, to their advantage to showcase you that, hey, they are really inclusive, and someone who came from there was able to flourish, in his own way, in his own direction, right? So
Yes, indeed.
I don't think it would deter. And I I do appreciate the fact that I think there may be more diversity there than say your average liberal college. In the sense that I do find it annoying, and more than annoying, that sometimes the clamp down on anything that diverges from what is the liberal norm is so harsh that it closes down debate. Anyway, that's a different topic altogether. So that I found that interesting that somebody who came from that environment at a very superficial level of my understanding of that environment turned out to be somebody who's pushing the envelope on some really crucial issues. So let me talk also about another thing I found interesting, which is I think your line of work, or perhaps you were trained since you talked about economics, is actuary risk, right? Your business is assessing risk. Would it be fair to say that?
Actuaries do assess risk. They typically assess it in an insurance context, but there is certainly a way of thinking about the world and a way of thinking about human choices that I think can be extrapolated.
Okay. Now, the reason I find that interesting is because I think somebody uh, who thinks or takes transhumanism seriously is probably somebody who is comfortable with risk and the unknown. Wouldn't you agree?
Well, I would say we need to be cognizant of risks and we need to assess them intelligently. And we need to also understand that any decision carries with it certain risks, including the decision not to act. And so we need to weigh the risks of action against the risks of inaction. This is the essence of the proactionary principle, which was articulated by Max More as essentially the response to the commonplace precautionary principle. And the problem with the precautionary principle is it only looks at the potential upsides or downsides of making a particular innovative decision. So the precautionary principle will ask, can we rule out at least the vast majority of the possible downsides of this technological advance? And only then do we accept the benefits of that advance. Whereas the proactionary principle says we have to consider the benefits and the risks of both the advance and the failure to pursue that advance. So how many people might be dying or afflicted by diseases or afflicted by other suboptimal living conditions because we don't have this technological capability right now? What are the dangers of a world in which we continue not to have this technological capability? And then we need to also consider what possible risks might arise from the new technology and weigh the benefits and costs of each option and then make a determination as to what in total will maximize human well-being.
Okay. So just to make sure I understand. So the precautionary, it's called principle, is it more akin to do no harm first?
Well, I think some instantiation of it, like in the medical field, may be formulated that way. But I think in policy circles, the precautionary principle is a bit more rigidly applied. So essentially, you have to anticipate every possibility of harm before you take an action. So the standard Hippocratic oath wouldn't require a physician to do that. The standard Hippocratic oath would just say, you need to be really careful in making sure that your action doesn't directly or egregiously harm the patient. But if you think there's some overarching benefit that could be worth the risk, obviously in medicine, as a medical practitioner, you can still make that choice. Whereas with the precautionary principle, for instance, you have to undergo extensive scrutiny from an environmental standpoint, from the standpoint of appeasing various public interest groups, so-called public interest groups, because sometimes they're special interest groups who pretend to be public interest groups. And they essentially set the agenda in terms of saying, well, we need to really make sure that all of these even remote hypothetical harms don't take hold, except the problem is some of them are materially invested in the status quo. So they might have a reason to oppose the innovative new development or new technology. And this is where the precautionary principle, I think, fails greatly, because I think there is a lot of motivated reasoning by many people to suggest that a particular advance may be too risky, whereas in the past, humans were quite inclined to take those kinds of calculated risks. For instance, the decision to replace the horse-drawn carriage with the automobile. Surely that involved some risks, and indeed about 40,000 people in the United States die in roadway accidents every single year. However, horse-drawn carriages had their own flaws as well, and if people were only focused on the potential of automobile-related accidents to lead to injury or death, they would miss out, for instance, on the fact that accidents also occurred in horse-drawn carriages, and they were fairly notorious back in the 19th century, or all of the air pollution and other pollution that occurred in cities as a result of so many horses being in close proximity. So I think it is very important, when considering any innovation, to also consider what are the problems with the status quo that this innovation is going to solve that would continue to pose significant harms if they are not resolved.
Okay. Now here's an interesting paradox, or at least maybe superficially a paradox. So Edmund Burke was a conservative, right? And he was very much all about being very slow in terms of progress, right? Okay, even things like child labor or liberating women, all that was very disruptive. And he was like, let's take it one step at a time. He was anti-revolution because he saw what happens when you have a revolution. You have just chaos and mayhem and murder, and you can't have progress unless you have peace and so forth, right? Very Hobbesian and so forth. He comes from that tradition. Now, what's interesting is that that's what conservatism is let's just, we have a baseline of a past, of stability, and let's just go slowly. From what I heard you say, and I think I've heard this many times, both in terms of me watching you talk as well as in my conversation with you, is that you have maybe a grievance, maybe that's too strong of a word, against these that you call them special interests, say environmentalists and so forth, and you point to them, who are progressives in the sense that they believe in progress, they believe in technology, they believe in pushing the envelope, they believe in moving forward. They come from that tradition of there's nothing innately fixed about society. We're progressing, we're learning, becoming better human beings, we're evolving both materially and morally and so forth, right? And so I want you to just talk to me a little bit about that, what seems to be a paradox, right? Conservatives right now are the ones who are like, no regulation, let's just take risks, right, and so forth. And the progressives, who come from a tradition of let's push the ball forward, let's progress, are the ones who seem to be, at least in your estimation, the ones who are holding innovation back. What do you think about that? Is that something that has anything interesting in it, or is it just an illusion that I'm experiencing?
This is quite an interesting observation, and coincidentally, I happen to have this coaster here with a quotation from Edmund Burke. Of course, Edmund Burke here says the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing, and that's not necessarily a conservative or progressive sentiment per se. It's a more universal sentiment, but I think it relates to the conversation we just had about the precautionary principle versus the proactionary principle. Sometimes when good men do nothing, evil outcomes happen, because I think we recognize there is a certain tendency toward chaos in, let's say, natural systems that are not guided by the human mind,
Mm-hmm.
that humans do not impart some sort of order upon.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is, again, not necessarily an exclusively conservative or progressive insight. So, for instance, Edmund Burke would have said, we have this edifice of civilization, we have art, culture, certain political institutions, certain social norms, and we shouldn't be too hasty in disrupting them. He was, of course, responding to the literal bloodbath that was the French Revolution, where people who were seen as inconvenient to the ambitions of an increasingly radicalized clique, the Jacobins, were literally executed. And he was saying this is not the way to implement beneficial social change. And in this regard, I actually agree with him. I don't believe violent political revolution is ever beneficial from the standpoint of improving human well-being. I will even go so far as to say the one possibly successful political revolution in history, the American Revolution, was not as clear-cut as might appear at first glance. So what did the American colonists rebel against? Well, several grievances. Of course, they did not want to have as much centralized control from the British Isles, yet compared to other forms of control that were widespread at the time and what other colonial powers were doing, the British were actually treating the American colonies quite mildly. What did the American colonists rebel over? They rebelled over a 3-cent tax on tea, maybe some quartering of troops in American colonists' homes. What did they get? They got a massive hyperinflation as a result of the unbacked continental currency. They got many years of hard economic times as a result of the War of Independence. And not too long after the American government was established, indeed during the presidency of John Adams in 1798, the United States enacted the Alien and Sedition Acts, which essentially curtailed freedom of speech and imprisoned political opponents of the Adams regime, something that the regime of King George III would have been very hesitant to do. So, of course, the United States moved away from the Alien and Sedition Acts shortly thereafter under Thomas Jefferson, but it is not at all clear in retrospect whether the American Revolution actually increased the extent of freedom available to the American colonists. So how do we implement progress? I do think we need to build upon the accomplishments of the past. And I have an essay called Progress, Creation, and Maintenance, which is also available in video format, where I explain this. So human beings are remarkably creative and innovative, even when left to their own devices in a relatively secure background setting of their lives. They're going to create works of art, works of literature, works of technology. At least there will be enough people who do to result in a very vibrant and forward-moving society. But there's an important caveat to that, and that is if the background of one's life is in continual turmoil, if all of the basic assumptions of one's existence are redone every single day or close to that time frame, and not in any sort of creative way, just essentially the old frameworks being replaced by some attempt to build something from the ground up. That's actually not conducive to progress, because let's say you have a large structure. Let's say you have a skyscraper, and it might be a fairly old skyscraper. The beams are not holding it up as well as they used to. There are some structural issues. Some of the facade is eroded. What do you do? Do you demolish the entire building and try to build something new? Or do you try to repair this building and maybe build on top of it? So I'm actually more inclined to support the second approach, because I'm concerned that the people who would demolish the skyscraper can only build wooden huts or some sort of thatch-roofed structures that they think are all new, but they're not going to last very long because they don't have the ingenuity that went into the older structures. So I would say transhumanism is a logical continuation of the sequence of human development, and it doesn't reject what came before. It builds upon it. So transhumanism has humanism in the name. So we actually embrace the great humanistic tradition of the Renaissance, of the Age of Enlightenment, because those thinkers also wanted to transcend the limitations of their times. We embrace the historic affinity for rational thought and for empirical discovery, for the scientific method in Western culture. We embrace the legacy of the Industrial Revolution and the material production and the increased abundance that came from that. And what we are more skeptical toward are people who are more of a back to nature persuasion. So this is common on the left, where I think this is inspired by Rousseau and his successors in the postmodernist school of thought, broadly speaking. Of course, there are many flavors of postmodernism. The postmodern paradigm that took hold in the mid-20th century, where there's more of a skepticism toward the general idea of progress, and there's more of a skepticism toward human activity. So the environmentalists, which really came to the forefront in the 1960s and the 1970s, they do have some legitimate concerns. Pollution is not a good thing. Climate change is not a good phenomenon. However, their philosophical framework is one that sees man primarily as a blight upon the earth, as an influence whose activities need to be curtailed. Whereas the transhumanist framework, which seeks to transcend this postmodern paradigm, sees humankind primarily as a beneficial influence, but one that is riddled with evolved flaws and limitations arising out of the problems with our own biology and with material scarcity. So if we can overcome those limitations in a thoughtful, intelligent, considerate manner, then we could also be a less flawed species and more effective in remedying various external problems, including the very environmental problems that the environmentalists are concerned about.
Yeah. Okay. There's a big word we're using here, the word progress, right? And as you know, there's this tendency about people to think of progress as occurring in, I don't know, in this etiological, way, like it's as if it has its own motion, as if the logic was within it, as if it was progressing without people pushing it one way or the other. But in fact, what we call progress, if you look at the history of humanity, that's another big word. It's dictated mainly by folks who are powerful, of money, who decide to build rockets like Elon Musk and whatever, right? And then the nation takes a direction, or there is a. It's not like progress is a collective reflection of humanity. There is a consensus about what is good for us in general. It's good this way or that way. I think it'd be fair to say that, for example, the Amazon is being decimated by, folks who have very, earthly, earthy even, desires. They want money, and it's not like they've talked to the and had a conversation with the folks in Brazil and decided collectively that this is the right thing to do, and so forth. And we talked in general, right? So given the fact that there are certain centers of power who decide where we go, right? Do you think it's unreasonable for there to be a pushback that is also trying to hold firm so that it can have a pushback? Meaning, the environmentalists, right? I think I agree with you. They have an argument that they make that is in fact cogent and rational and needs to be taken seriously in the sense of sustainability, right? It's not like I like to hug trees because they are trees and I don't care about anything else. I just care about trees, and I look at the human being as a blight on Earth. No, I'm actually very concerned about human beings, and I want the Earth to be inhabitable by human beings. I care about human beings as the center, right? I don't want the temperature to rise because I don't want human beings to disappear as a species or to suffer. If I cared, if those who care only about nature, they wouldn't care what would happen to human beings. So my point being that there is an argument to be made, and I don't think you disagree with that, hey, we need to conserve nature because by conserving nature, we're taking care of ourselves so we can live, a healthy life. But when you have these forces who are brutal forces, who have money, who have cash, and who go and actually evacuate the natives from their land and do those things because they have the guns and they have the governments behind them, which they bribe and so forth, don't you need like a radical force to go back as opposed to a force that is trying to, loungy, that talks about and tries to engage these generals in conversations as opposed to action, action that highlights what they're doing. For example, a lot of people, they poo-poo or they say, what are these people who are throwing paint on, on museum? Look at them, look at how outrageous it is at what they're doing. And my response to that is like, yeah, maybe it's outrage equal to the outrage on the other side. Maybe you will start thinking about the level of outrage that's happening on the other side by waking up and wondering what's going on. So my point is, you seem to say, and again, I may be wrong, you seem to say that the progress is sort of like a dialogue that happens, and then we all reach a consensus and it's rational. But in fact, a lot of that progress is being pushed by pure violence and pure power and pure money. And it needs a counterweight that cannot be a counterweight unless it also is pushing back with equal force. Do you think that I'm sort of like seeing things in a little bit more extreme ways? Probably, right?
Well, I do have a different perspective from the one that you articulated. First, let me point out the people who are engaged in this kind of slash and burn agriculture in the Amazonian rainforests are not the same ones who are building rockets or funding biotechnology ventures. You could say, well, there is a degree of wealth and power in both of those kinds of initiatives, but if you look at the people involved, there's essentially no overlap. And if you also look at what emerging technologies can do, they can make this kind of very primitive and very destructive slash and burn approach obsolete. So why are many people interested these days in cutting down the Amazonian rainforest? And I agree that is a tragedy. They are interested in having more arable land. Why are they interested in having more arable land? Because the land that they have possession of does not have enough viable crop density. So how can that be changed? Through a continuation of the green agricultural revolution that began in the mid-20th century, where crop yields per unit of territory were improved dramatically through selective breeding, through genetic engineering, and also advances like vertical farming, which the Transhumanist Party enthusiastically supports, could lead to a lot more agriculture within cities themselves, which is actually going to be a lot more convenient for people because they will not have to face the prospect of supply chain disruptions that we have unfortunately been living with for the past 2.5 years. So technology creates the possibility that a lot of these objectionable techniques will no longer be economically viable. And the people with power and money, they don't necessarily exist on the cutting edge of progress. This is another area where I would disagree with you, at least in part, in the sense that, yes, you need investments to drive technological advancements forward, but the presence of money and power by themselves do not generate the progress. Throughout much of human history, we have had extremely top-heavy societies where people with incredible amounts of wealth and land and serfs and slaves and armies controlled most of human life. And yet they couldn't often protect themselves against what today would be simply curable ailments. And many of these powerful kings and nobles died in their 30s or earlier. And if they lived into their 60s, they were considered to have led a long, full life. So I would not trade places with them, even though I don't have nearly the same amount of power. I think the influence of the human mind, of creative thinkers, of inventors, of scientists, of public intellectuals, should not be discounted. And it is the influence of those great minds upon the people with resources and with power that could catalyze progress. So I don't disagree with you. It is really beneficial to have an enlightened billionaire on one side. It is really beneficial to have an enlightened head of state on one side. And I think the great philosophers of the 18th century Age of Enlightenment also recognized this. This is why they appealed to monarchs like Frederick the Great or Catherine the Great. And they had mixed success because those monarchs had their own agendas. But surely the philosophical spirit of the Age of Enlightenment enabled rulers like Frederick and Catherine to be far more humane than they might have been during an earlier age. So progress, in my view, should not happen through violent upheavals, because the violent upheavals destroy that which is valuable. They destroy that which we should actually seek to further build upon. So if these protesters, though I hesitate to use the term, are vandalizing artworks, whom does that help? It doesn't solve the problem of deforestation. It just destroys artworks. It ruins something innocuous that people would have enjoyed otherwise. And likewise, the infrastructure of our daily lives is very important to preserve, because the next generation of innovators, they're going to be successful or unsuccessful based on essentially the support framework that they've had. So if they've led comfortable lives where they have good homes, where they can study in peace, where they have supportive social circles, where there's not a whole lot of chaos in their lives, they're going to be able to focus more on their creative endeavors, whatever those may be. Whereas if they live in a society where there's always blood in the streets, there are constant riots, there's scarcity of basic materials, then they're going to be focused on day-to-day survival. They're going to be focused on navigating the system rather than creating the next generation of advancements. So it's a question of the long-term impacts of these actions as well. I think if the extent of rioting decreased dramatically, we would see a great acceleration of the kind of progress that most people would appreciate and value and seek to be a part of. So that's why I don't believe in violent activism, especially in the political sphere, but any sort of violence I would see as antithetical to the transhumanist vision of progress.
Okay, well, let me react about 2 points, then we'll move on to the next thing. First of all, I think an enlightened billionaire for me is an oxymoron. I don't think there is such a thing. I think billionaires are living their bubbles and whatever enlightenment. I'd rather have that money spread and have a very strong middle class, because we've seen, at least in the history of Western cultures, right? When you have a very strong middle class, I mean, that's when a lot of people who are enterprising and all the geniuses, they appear, and that just changes things, I think, in a far more healthy and sustainable way than having, say, a Jeff Bezos or a Musk or whatever doing whatever things they want to do. So that's one thing. I think we'll just we'll have like delta between your position and mine on that. As for the paintings, I think I happen to support those guys in the following way, and I'll just say a couple of words on that and we'll move on. In the following sense, by the way, those paintings, they, in these galleries, they have like a glass and all that, and when they throw that paint, it just washes off. And I've never heard anyone say that they were destroyed completely, right? They just get scratched here in the frame. They just humor me on that front, right? What is useful about that is the following, right? When people go and they get outraged about that, which is a natural human reaction. Why would you do that to a Van Gogh? God damn it, right? Let people go and visit these museums, right? When they do that, I think, for me, the first time I reacted to that with an actual outrage, say, what the fuck, why are these guys doing this, right? And then when I sat down and thought and said, okay, so let's take that emotion and grade it from 0 to 10. It was a 9, right? It was very powerful. Now let me go, I'm talking to myself, and how strong is your emotion against, I don't know, people who pollute the rivers? These guys, when they find an opportunity, right? These companies, they will, how about my level of outrage to what happened in, was it Detroit or Michigan or whatever? The river was polluted and children were drinking water, had lead in it. And they had this a few years ago, and I don't think they're out of the woods yet, right? These children, they were drinking water, it was polluted, and they were mainly minority children. Something happened about the pipe and whatever. The bottom line really is that that's an outrage, and this is an outrage. Or the outrage of raping the environment. If you look at what's going on, I mean, if you take the trouble, compare those two outrages, I'm like, it's easy to get outraged here. Why don't you go and take the trouble and find out exactly what's going on as a result of what those guys are doing, so that you can measure the two outrages. This guy is destroying, not even destroying a painting and you're getting all riled up. These guys are destroying a human life, actually, destroying the environment. And because it's diffuse, so, it just happens. It's not in front of me. It's not easily graphic. You can't represent graphically, like gory. You can't do it, right? Then I start to reflect about, am I a child? Do I need imagery? Do I need to be like shown the blood of children to get all riled up? Or should I actually get riled up just by understanding what's going on? So for me, that was useful. That exercise was very useful to me. I started to reflect about, in my latte, I go on Saturday morning with my latte and I look at the Van Gogh, and it's nicely air conditioned or warm, and it's very nice. Isn't it very nice to do those galleries? And I'm living in this bubble. And what those guys did when they did that, right? They said, fuck you, right? Wake up, you guy, who you think you are at the ultimate, the border of civilization, watching the Van Gogh and appreciating it and talking about it. Wake up, right? There are things that should outrage you. That outrage should be a lot more than you being outraged about the paintings. Wanted to make that point. I've been waiting for an opportunity to make it.
Well, if I could respond briefly,
please,
yes. There are injustices and outrages that happen daily throughout the world and have happened throughout history. And yes, we should be aware of them, and we should have a negative emotional response to them. But does that justify vandalizing, damaging, even slightly something that's good, or disrupting an activity that actually is turning out all right for people? People are enjoying viewing those paintings. My view is 2 wrongs don't make a right. And just because there is suffering somewhere in the world, or an injustice or an improper action, doesn't mean that that same emotion or that same suffering needs to be imported everywhere else. Quite the contrary, we should try to reduce the total amount of suffering and injustice in the world. And whenever we have a pocket of the world that's good and that doesn't have those problems, we should enjoy and appreciate that. So that's my response. By the way, I do agree with you about a vibrant middle class and the importance of fostering that. So we should have both enlightened billionaires and an enlightened middle class that is sufficiently broad.
No, I think there's more intersection between us. I just want to highlight sort of the deltas because sometimes they are interesting.
You've been listening to Humanity 8.0 with your host, Dr. Ahmed Bouzid, founder and CEO of Witlingo. Brought to you by Rokos. Thanks for listening.